afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion today entitled Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, Will Corruption Undermine the Eastern Partnership? This is a joint initiative of the London-based Legatum Institute and the Institute for Modern Russia. The National Endowment for Democracy has the pleasure of hosting this event. Although the National Endowment for Democracy hasn't been involved with the production of the reports that are the basis of the discussion today, we have close ties with these organizations that are represented here, and we're very proud to host and be associated with today's event. NED's International Forum has been engaged in an ongoing collaborative project with Anne Applebaum and her colleagues at the Legatum Institute, exploring the role of economics in democratic transitions. This ongoing initiative is examining the experiences and challenges of several critically important countries in transitions. Like the issues being addressed at today's panel, our initiative with Legatum is aimed at acquiring a better diagnosis of the challenges facing transitional countries with reform ambitions in order to identify approaches that can help enable successful outcomes. Today's discussion is particularly important and timely on several levels. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova are fighting difficult battles to achieve reform internally, but at the same time face very serious external obstacles that are relevant to this goal. These include a regional standard that is one of corrupt authoritarian governance in the non-Baltic former Soviet space, and of paramount concern is a Russian government that's dedicated to obstructing and containing the emergence of democratic systems on its borders. As the war instigated by Moscow against Ukraine shows us, Russia's posture is particularly threatening for the countries that hold the most reform process, a factor that is acutely relevant for Moldova and Georgia as well. The contributors to the reports that will be discussed today are on the panel, so I'll take the liberty of saying what they may be too modest to say themselves. These for the two reports that are already out there and can be read. The Ukraine and the Georgia reports. These are really first-rate pieces of analysis, and I encourage everyone here to read these reports. Now, just a quick word on social media. For those of you who are on Twitter, you can contribute to the conversation today and follow the discussion by using the hashtag #LootingUkraine or by following the International Forum for Democratic Studies @ThinkDemocracy and the Legatum Institute @LegatumINST. That's all one word, LegatumINST. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Anne Applebaum. Anne leads the Legatum Institute's Transition Forum and is a columnist for Washington Post and Slate. She's an author of several books, including Bullough, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Her most recent book, Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, won the 2013 Kundil Prize for Historical Literature and was nominated for a National Book Award in the U.S. Those of you who follow her columns know her for being among the most insightful thinkers and clearest voices on the nature of today's challenge, including the profound challenge Russia is posing to the liberal order. With that, it's my pleasure to hand things over to Anne.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm here with as the head of the Transitions Forum at the Legatum Institute, which, for those of you who don't know it, is a bipartisan public policy think tank in London. And the Transitions Forum has sought to explain, analyze, describe, and find some better ways of discussing the process of democratic transitions, countries that are in the course of making radical changes. This event is a little bit unusual because we are, as Chris accurately said, we are presenting not one but, oh, sorry, this one. Right. Do I need to repeat that?
Or did you all hear me? No, for the website? No, okay. Okay, sorry, so I was not entirely heard. This is unusual because we are presenting not one but three reports. And they had slightly different origins, and I will just say one or two words about them because it's important to understand what they are. Peter Pomerantsev, whose full biography is in the sheet you've been handed out, who's a British author and documentary maker, and really one of the two or three really great British writers on Russia today. We have the other one right here, so I'll turn to him in a second. Wrote a report on Georgia that was conceived as, in a way, it was a joint project. So Peter and I and a Serbian colleague, Jovan Ratkovic, and a well-known British human rights lawyer all went and spent some time in Georgia together. My idea was that they would contribute their experience to analysis of Georgia's police and judicial reforms, and which is a complicated way of saying we were looking at how the Georgians sought to rid their country of corruption. And I'll ask Peter to say a few more words about that in a minute. Georgia is the one of these three countries which had a program. We're going to fight corruption, we're going to deal with it, we're going to eliminate it. And it succeeded in some ways and failed in others, as Peter will describe. The other two papers that we're launching today, one is the paper on Ukraine by Oliver Bullough, who's the other great writer about Russia in Britain. Both of them have extensive pedigrees, have written everywhere, published books and so on. But Oliver went and, again, like Peter, spent some time in Ukraine, and he wasn't studying a successful or largely successful transformation as Peter was. He was trying to describe the problem as it exists. What is the nature of Ukrainian corruption, and so on. The Moldova paper, the author is unfortunately not here. Vladimir Solovyev, who is the editor-in-chief of Kommersant Moldova in Chisinau, he's not here because he did not get a U.S. visa, which I think all of us in this room know that particular problem. It's one of the difficulties we have even of talking about some of these issues in this country. And with us instead, and who would have been alongside us in any case, Olga Khvostunova, who is actually translated that paper and worked with Vladimir on it and can say a few words about his argument. He was also looking at the problem of corruption in Moldova, what's the nature of it, and what's the relationship between corruption and democracy, and how it might hamper Moldova's progress. I mean, the three papers, so although the paper on Georgia was conceived a little bit differently, they do work as a package because, as those of you in this room obviously know, these are the three countries which are now the active members of the Eastern Partnership. All three of them have growing and extensive association agreements with the European Union. They are countries where they're at least a part of the elite, and at least a part of the population is pro-Western, or is anyway, in any case, interested in integrating itself with Europe, and that distinguishes them from much of the rest of the post-Soviet space right now. So it's very important to understand who they are, and what are the issues that would hamper them from making further progress in that direction. I'll start with Peter and ask him to talk just a little bit about the Georgia paper and what it was that we discovered. Because, as I say, the Georgia paper was the product of, there were several other people involved in it. Although, of course, it's Peter's voice and Peter's paper ultimately. Maybe he can explain a little bit about what we concluded.
Sure. Is this working okay?
It works.
So I'm just going to sort of hit some sort of key beats. And just to add, none of us that went are Georgia experts. I know in this room there are people who are sort of the best Georgia experts around. So we're all coming to this subject each from our own experience. I mean, Anne was thinking about how it related to sort of the shutting down of Eastern Europe. I was thinking about Russia. Jovan was thinking about Serbia. So it was a very interesting project that way. I'll just talk about some key points, and then maybe we can bounce off them in no particular order, really. The first one is a sort of the Georgians are fascinating because they really, one reads about sort of like the Jacobins or sort of the French Revolution. These were people who were committed to a revolutionary ethic and a revolutionary mode of thought and a revolutionary tactic.
This is the Saakashvili.
Yeah, I'm talking about the UNM, the 2004 guys and girls.
Many girls.
Yes, a lot. That was one of their big things. But it was also a gender revolution in many ways. But they really had a revolutionary logic, and now they're out of government. They could talk about it quite openly. They were quite frank. They said, we made a hell of a lot of mistakes. We cut a lot of corners. We broke some eggshells. And it was very interesting now in the sort of the relative calm after the storm of their revolutionary fervor to talk about what was right and wrong. What they seemed to get right, and what was very interesting, was that they sort of developed a revolutionary procedure. what they realized very fast was in this sort of hugely corrupt and criminalized state, where do you start? I mean, there'd been lots of attempts to start reforms, but you've got to start somewhere. And what was interesting is they picked on this famous police reform that maybe a few of you have heard of. They started with something very small and in a way quite in and of itself meaningless, traffic police. But it was something that they could do, firstly. They needed to prove to the population that you could do reforms. And they talk about it as it was a marketing for the absolute idea of reforms. It was an intellectual victory. By doing that, they felt they had the confidence of the people to then move forward and do other things. I mean, clearly we have something very similar in Ukraine. How does Ukraine even start reforms? What does it choose? So that was very interesting because traffic police in of itself, not a big deal. Doesn't really change a country. But that became their kind of own little marketing idea that could make the very idea of reform possible. Skipping on, though, onto sort of the next big point, I suppose, is that the fact they were such revolutionaries and such, full of such fervor meant that they really didn't listen to anyone around themselves. They were completely convinced they were right, failed to create an opposition, which led to a lot of problems that went on to undermine them. But there was one problem in particular, which I think is sort of the standout black mark on the Saakashvili regime, which is while they cleaned up corruption in a lot of areas, the justice system was basically a joke. It was 99.9% guilty verdicts. We had a lawyer with us who'd actually had experience of working, a British lawyer, in the Georgian justice system, and he said it was ridiculous. I mean, the prosecutor was, just basically told the judge what to do. This was visible on a kind of a sort of a relationship level inside the actual courts. But the question is, and it's very easy to criticize that, but the question that we came across, and this was something that our colleague from Serbia, Jovan Ratkovic, would talk about, because they had a similar problem in Serbia. In a situation where the society is so corrupt and where the courts will be corrupt, if you don't create courts which are essentially in the pocket of a reformist government, how can you start putting the bad guys in jail? How can you start putting criminals in jails when the criminals were controlling the justice system? And he described it as sort of a chicken and egg that no reformer has really found an exit out of. Or maybe you guys know some reformers who have found a way out of it. But in order to do the reforms, you have to have a justice system that is essentially in your pocket. And you sort of get addicted to that. So I think it's a systemic problem. It's not just a problem of the Saakashvili regime. It might actually just be a problem that revolutionary governments have. And there's two more points I'd like to touch on very, very briefly, or shall I?
No, that's fine.
Fine. So
keep talking.
That's sort of what I've been talking about so far is sort of the tactics of reforms itself. But there's two kind of issues on the side which emerged from our journey there, which are kind of key because they frame everything, and they become kind of the magnetic poles through which everything else is decided. On the one hand is this question of motivation. Became very clear from sort of a reading of Georgian history, and a reading from the history of the Georgian dissident movement in the 60s and 70s, that in Georgia, the project, what we thought of, or what they described as a pro-Western project, was more about creating a strong state rather than human rights. It was about national rights rather than human rights. It was about a strong bureaucracy rather than a fair bureaucracy. And this is very important. All their thinking right from the start was actually, their great heroes were Ataturk, were Singapore, not necessarily Estonia. So this was very interesting. So right from the start, and we're talking about going back to the 1960s, the idea of democracy was more about a strong state rather than a fair state. And
in the context of an extremely weak and corrupt state.
Yeah, no, this is an understandable, and also in the context of a threat from a very powerful imperial neighbor. But that question of motivation, when we look at Ukraine now, is very interesting. How did they get the motivation right from the start? And the other one is the sort of the role of Western actors, or the international community. It was incredibly important for the Georgians to have this idea that they're going to get into NATO, they're going to get into the EU. And we all came away, I think, with the feeling that what happens when they wake up and realize it's not going to happen? Is that going to be a big kind of fall-through moment? And people gave very different answers. A lot of people said, no, we just want reforms for reform itself. Other people seem to have sort of like, little spasms when we'd say that. Like, what do you mean we're not getting in? And these are sort of people who work in policy. So there seemed to be sort of like the potential for a huge disappointment there. And the last point was the Saakashvili government got very good at playing a certain game about reforms, about getting very, very good marks in various indices. The Russians have got quite good at this now. And part of the problem was that they would be complemented for a lot of reforms based on these sort of transparency indices and so forward and so on, while actually there was a sense within the country that sort of the international community was sort of like patting their pets on the head while ignoring the bad parts. And with Ukraine, I think, as we move forward, that's going to be very important, that you know, the international community retains a bridge to civil society and not just to government. That's a lot of stuff.
Good, thank you. No, we'll pick that apart a little bit more later. But essentially, the Georgia paper was an analysis of the past. You know, what did Saakashvili do when he came to power? How did he try to fight corruption? And then we tried to tease out what might be some lessons for others. And Peter has just hinted at what some of those are. Oliver's paper was different because he's in a country which has not truly, although there's a lot of talk constantly about corruption. It's a country that hasn't dealt with it, and is still really in the same kind of situation that Georgia was in the 90s when Saakashvili came to power, in the early 2000s. Why don't you describe a little bit about the main arguments of your paper, of your research?
Thanks. Slightly what I was, this is Ukraine's second revolution in a decade, and I think partly one of the things that led me to writing about corruption was attempting to understand why the first revolution, the Orange Revolution of 2004 to 5, failed so utterly. Asking around and talking to a lot of people about that, and the thing people kept coming back to was corruption, that this had been a revolution explicitly intended to make Ukraine more European, a more rule of law driven state, where, you know, top businessmen weren't able to do whatever they wanted, where, you know, government officials didn't take bribes, and that totally failed. Ukraine went backwards in that regard between 2004 and 2013 quite dramatically. By last year, on the Transparency International Transparency Perceptions Index, Ukraine was 144th, which is the same ranking as Central African Republic and Nigeria. And I think if you start thinking of Ukraine as essentially, from a governance standpoint, of being sub-Saharan African, it makes a lot more sense than if you think of it as being Eastern European. If you think it can't control its territory, the central government is very weak. These are things that describe Central African Republic as well as they describe Ukraine. So it was coming at it from that perspective made me try and figure out, thought it would be very interesting to try and work out the dimensions of corruption and you know, some of its key sort of salient characteristics, because I think this is an under-researched issue, and quite obviously, for obvious reasons, it's something that hasn't been well publicized. We have this very lucky window owing to the fact that Viktor Yanukovych fled and left quite a lot of his documents behind him. It's been possible to research the nature of corruption in a way which hasn't been possible before. And I was also slightly going from the assumption that the nature of post-Soviet corruption is equivalent in almost all the ex-Soviet states. So by looking at Ukraine, this in a way wasn't only about Ukraine, but it was also about Russia and so on and so forth. So in terms of the dimensions of corruption, the numbers, you hear a lot of numbers, but the one which people keep coming back to is that approximately $30 billion a year was being embezzled from the state budget, which is somewhere between a fifth and a sixth of Ukrainian national output. That obviously is an unsustainable burden for a country to bear, to have that much money stolen. And it was being stolen by a very well-organized, essentially pyramidical structure directed by the people at the top, which were Viktor Yanukovych. His chief prosecutor, Pshonka, as well, was probably the second most important figure, because, as Peter made very clear, the prosecutors in the former Soviet Union have a tremendous amount of power, and the judges do what they're told by the prosecutors. Therefore, if the government and the prosecutors team up to do something, they can essentially do whatever they want. The breakdown of that money, the 30 billion, is probably about 2/3 of it was money that was embezzled before it went into the budget via straightforward tax evasion, normally organized through something called tax holes, which are special companies formed for the deliberate purpose of tax evasion, in which you give them money and they return it in cash, which has all sorts of benefits, which if you read the report I go into at some length. A third of the money was embezzled probably via abuse of the state procurement system. During the reign of Yanukovych, the procurement law was repeatedly amended to make it less and less and less transparent. By the end, probably about a third of the total procurement budget was being stolen. And in the report I go in at some length into, just because it's quite a a well-documented example of this into the way that money was embezzled that was due to be spent on HIV and TB drugs, which it shows quite how far corruption had gone if officials didn't mind the fact that they were stealing a fifth of the budget intended for the most vulnerable people in society. And then the very interesting question, and something which was a key part of how I was looking at this, is where did the money go? It's very clear the money isn't in Ukraine. You just have to walk around Ukraine to understand that. So where is the money? An anti-corruption campaigner explained to me that the best way to find where the money goes is to look for where the rich people keep their children. Children are something the one thing that you cannot hide in a shell company, and the children are, as everyone is aware, in London, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, and in the United States. This is where the money ends up. So what I really wanted to know is, how does the money get here? If money is embezzled in Donetsk, how does it end up buying a prime property in Manhattan? And essentially, while looking at this, and there are a number of investigations. One is the investigation into Yanukovych's papers, which were discovered in his palace, Mezhihirya, outside Kiev. Another one is a separate investigation undertaken by Bill Browder's Hermitage Capital, which looks into the embezzlement of money from Russia. It's very clear that there is an extremely well-organized and apparently largely untroubled money laundering operation that exists to move money from the former Soviet Union via banks in Latvia, Cyprus, Austria, and ending up in London or in other major financial centres. And this system exists independently of individual scams. It's essentially a criminal banking network for former Soviet clients. And it exists around a number of essential nodes that are well known and well documented. And yet there is absolutely no sign that financial regulators have done anything to shut this down at all. And so it's very difficult to, sadly I can't, as I could in London, when we're talking about this in London, I could say that Yanukovych's palace was owned in Harley Street, which was about half a mile away from where we were sitting at the time. There isn't anything that dramatic with regard to this latest Ukrainian government with regard to the United States, but it's worth pointing out that Pavel Lazarenko, who was a prime minister in the 1990s, did keep all of his money in California and Wyoming. So the United States is involved in this as well, though in this particular example it was much more about Europe. It's very difficult to escape the conclusion that the Western financial system and the under-regulation, particularly in Eastern Europe, has been essentially criminogenic with regard to Eastern Europe. If these people were not able to keep the money they were stealing, they would not have been stealing the money in such vast quantities. So essentially, when it came to the recommendations, policy recommendations that I tried to come up with at the end of the report, I focused very much on recommendations that were less to do with Ukraine and more to do with us, what we could do to prevent our financial system being abused by kleptocrats from the former Soviet Union, because I think it's, hopefully I make the case and I argue very strongly that were it not for their access to the Western financial system, these kleptocrats would not have stolen as much as they've stolen. And I'm quite keen to make the point that I don't think this is just a question of doing the right thing. I think that this is definitely now, and I think certainly post MH17, that's become very clear, this has become a national security issue. The fact that essentially criminal regimes are able to have unfettered access to our financial system perpetuates their criminality and in fact accentuates it. The argument being that essentially the more chaotic the former Soviet Union is, the more money these people are able to steal. And so it is in their interests to keep things as bad as they can be for as long as possible. So in terms of the thing that we could do most to help Ukraine now, at this particular time, because it is imperative to act now to prevent this revolution failing as the last one did, is to enforce the laws that already exist, the regulations that already exist, to cut off the access of stolen money, the way stolen money can enter our financial system. And I mean, this is very easily done. I'm sure there are many people in this room who know how post 9/11 the financial system very quickly reacted to prevent terrorist financing, and very effectively. These tools already exist. It's just a question of repurposing them and using them in a slightly different way. So that's, yeah, if anyone had any questions about anything more specific about that, I'm happy to talk about it, but that's the general thrust of what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So as I said, the third paper, which is on Moldova, will be discussed by Olga Khvostunova, who's not not the author, but was very involved in shaping and translating the paper. And she is herself a research fellow at the Institute of Modern Russia and very knowledgeable about Russian media and other things. But she will summarize Vladimir's paper, who, because as I said, he's alas not here.
When I was working on this paper with Vladimir, I realized that even though I lived in Russia for a long time and I've lived in the Soviet Union, I've known much about Ukraine and Georgia, but I haven't known much about Moldova. So I don't know, I'm sure there are experts on Moldova here, but I've discovered a few new things for myself, so I'm going to share about the situation, the current situation, and the background. And I think it explains why Moldova is currently at the crossroads. Until recently, Moldova was the poorest country in Europe, and I think now it's Ukraine because of the...
It's a close race.
Yeah, but I think Moldova is a little bit winning at this point. Yeah.
I think Ukraine's more losing it.
Maybe, yeah, that's true. This country has been living off the agricultural exports to Russia and European Union. Until 2009, basically the parties that were ruling in the country were either communist or agricultural, very leftist forces. So in 2009, when the communists lost, an alliance for European integration became a ruling majority in the parliament. And Moldova is a parliamentary republic, so basically the parties that get votes and get into the parliament, they vote to elect the president, and members of these parties also become ministers. So the Alliance for European Integration was a coalition of 4 parties, basically very, very close in terms of ideological spectrum. So it was a liberal party, democratic party, a liberal democratic party, and there was a small party called Our Moldova. The intrigue here is that when Vladimir Voronin, who is the leader of the Communist Party, which is still very much popular in Moldova, when he was the president, he claimed that he wants to reinvent the Communist Party, and he wants a sort of a European type of Communist Party. It was in 2003. It was during this time Russia was trying to implement the so-called federalization plan in Moldova, but Voronin decided to go the other way, and he said that, you know, Moldova has to go towards European Union. And it was also during the time, I think in 2004, when a number of new states from Eastern Europe joined the EU, so it was all big success and very, very attractive. But even though those claims were made, nothing much happened over 5 years, and by 2009, the public that was very much expecting some benefits from the European Union integration was not getting anything, and that's why the communists basically lost. So the so-called Democrats came to power, and they immediately claimed that they're going to move towards European integration, they're going to implement all kinds of reforms, do everything that's required to become part of European Union. However, by now, it kind of came clear that despite all those claims, despite some reforms that have been implemented, that also made Moldova a success story on paper, because Moldova now has a visa-free regime with the European Union. It has signed the association agreement, and it's in many ways much more forward, in terms of integration than Ukraine and Georgia. However, when you look close, you see that the situation is not that clear-cut. First of all, the major issue that's been said by many experts is corruption issue, like in Ukraine and Georgia. And the gravest problem of corruption it can be found is in the country's judiciary, which Vladimir actually describes in the paper, and all courts and all branches of the judiciary are compromised. One of the cases is when the Constitutional Court voted for former Prime Minister not to be able to run again for the office on some unsubstantiated claims of corruption. So after that, there was a rumor in the media that the 6 court judges became millionaires. However, it couldn't be proved. Another major issue is that because this alliance appeared to be so pro-democratic, but it turned out not to be so. It can be, there are 4 parties with 4 leaders, and it turned out that these leaders are actually former businessmen who came into politics to protect and to advance their own interests. They might be interested in integrating into Europe, but in fact, a lot of them have close connections to Russia, and they have businesses in Russia. For example, there is a case that also discussed in this paper how through Moldova, $18.5 billion were embezzled over the last 5 years using the scheme involving Moldovan banks, Moldovan citizens, some offshore companies, etc. And because the judiciary is compromised, criminal cases were, of course, open, but nothing happened. The investigation is ongoing. No one has been accused of anything. No one has been sentenced to anything. And over the 20 years, none of the high-profile officials in Moldova has been sentenced, in a criminal case to anything. Also, there is another issue coming up now that once the Alliance for European Integration came to power, there were some developments in the economy that also undermine, Moldova is weak and there is not much to take, but there are some assets that have been acquired by unknown owners, unknown companies. So the public tried and the media tried to investigate who is behind those deals.
You're talking about privatization.
Yeah.
Which companies are privatized in Moldova, and the proceeds fall into the hands of unclear people.
Yeah, and because Vladimir works for Kommersant Moldova, he has some sources. We can't prove that, but he says that most of them are acquired by a number of Moldovan oligarchs, which are close to Russia. And at this moment, the Moldovan government announced a big privatization plan, and 200 assets of Moldovan property are going to go for sale. And if these assets end up in the hands of those few people, oligarchs, the economy is going to be undermined because it's kind of. And finally, the media situation is kind of peculiar in a way that Moldova is considered one of the most successful in terms of countries on the post-Soviet space in terms of freedom of speech. You basically can write anything you want, and there are investigations are published, people are getting exposed, but the problem is that nothing happens next. So no one picks up the case, no one wants to actually pursue the investigation for real. At this moment, those few TV channels that were in Moldova, they were also kind of acquired by one of the most influential media tycoons in Moldova, Vladimir Plahotniuc. So it kind of reminds me of the situation in the 90s in Russia, while there were a number of oligarchs who were fighting amongst themselves, and it kind of created this the idea that there is some democracy, there is competition, there is opposition, but in fact it was just a small group of people fighting for their own interests. And this is what's happening in Moldova right now.
And I should say one of the conclusions I came to after reading the Moldova paper was that the kind of pro-European coalition or alliance, both in the country and in politics, is very much in danger of being compromised as simply a front for corruption. And this, of course, is this could be the future of Ukraine if the current Ukrainian government is not able to fight corruption in some meaningful ways and change the situation. Then it too is in danger of being compromised, and people will turn away from it, and perhaps simultaneously turn away from the idea of EU integration. I don't know if you agree with that.
Absolutely,
But,
yeah. I mean, people are very aware. It's been very well covered in the European media, very aware of the role that Western banks and shell companies have played in allowing their former government to loot the country. And there is an enormous amount of expectation that assets will be returned, stolen assets will be returned to Ukraine. But sadly, I mean, certainly the last case of Lazarenko, the former prime minister I referred to, that his money was stolen in the late 90s, it still hasn't been returned. So I think there's going to be a lot of expectation management ahead to try and explain this, as court cases take a very long time. And the people trying not to have their money taken from them have an awful lot of money to fight the court cases with.
Can you tease out from the work that you did? I mean, we talked about this a little bit. Lessons for like Ukraine and Moldova from Georgia, if any.
Well, yes. Well, I mean, there's lots in terms of revolutionary tactics. I mean, the way we almost have like sort of you can put together a guidebook for revolutionary tactics from what the Rose revolutionaries did. I mean, I remember a quote from Kaka Bendukidze, the controversial but very charismatic oligarch stroke minister stroke intellectual guru of the revolution, who said, he said, on the instructions of Kalashnikovs, it says, this is a killing instrument. You can shoot with it, you can stab with it, or you can hit somebody over the head with it. Same with reforms. You have to use any method out there. And then another thing he would talk about a lot was you've got to sell the reforms. You've got to find the messaging for it. So there's almost like a whole guidebook that you can take out of the Georgian process. And I think that will happen. I mean, we've seen sort of various Georgian figures appearing in Ukraine, and my sense is they're looked on very critically in Ukraine. Nobody's listening to them as sort of like these as saints, but they're very interested to hear about their experience. But it's not just for the Ukrainians that the lesson is. We keep on coming back to this incredible role, and one that we can actually exert far more influence over, of international institutions and of the international community. So there's several things. I mean, we sort of keep on talking about the question of corruption. I was in Ukraine recently. I heard similar things. One of the things that the Ukrainian reformers kept on telling me is the IMF is giving us a 5 billion loan. Can you just give us the 10 billion back that you helped steal? Mm-hmm. They find it ridiculous. So they think that their attitude is we've basically profited off the money stolen from the Ukrainian budget, and now we're lending them money. This is ridiculous. So there's a real anger there. But another thing from the Georgian experience is how do we measure reforms? How do we measure the success of reforms? We talk about successful reforms, unsuccessful reforms. We don't really have very many mechanisms for measuring them. The World Bank has some, Transparency International. What I think we're seeing is sort of an exhaustion of some of these methods. In Georgia, the methods, they started to become almost a formality. The Russians, for example, have recently surged up the perception of transparency in business index.
Doing business.
Yeah, that one. So the Russians are like right nearly at the top of it. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's terrible doing business there. So it's almost as we need to have these mechanisms with which to sort of measure reform. So I think that's a real intellectual challenge that sort of the World Bank, the IMF face. So that's a couple of issues.
Mm-hmm. I would be delighted to take a few comments now from this amazingly numerous and well-educated audience, and then I'll continue talking among ourselves as well. But I already see lots of hands, so let's do 1, 2, 3, since you're all on that side of the room, and then I'll switch to the other side of the room. Comments or questions or contributions to the conversation about both about what the West can do, and also what Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova can do. So yes.
Well, first, thank you for doing this. Just as a one-sentence background to my question, I started going out in the 70s to the Central Asian states, lived for a year or two in Uzbekistan, and wrote a book back then on systemic corruption and how it all works.
What's
in
it called?
Central Asia at the time. It was my doctoral dissertation, so it's got the worst name, but it's Labor and Nationality in Soviet Central Asia. And but the point was that it went way beyond the justice system and everything else, but just permeated the way all of these former republics, even in the Soviet system, even work. For the last 20 years, I've headed a research and consulting group where we've been the perpetrators of all this corruption. We've been out there working with contractors and, corporations and everyone trying to navigate their way through. And while some of these projects and development projects and whatever have been very successful in one way or another, most, in our view, and we're finishing up another book now that'll have a better title, but most have done much more harm and really exacerbated corruption more than addressed it, and for a number of really good reasons. So I think, without going into what we're looking at, that's what struck me most about your experiences in these three countries. And I'm just curious if you were looking at a bit more detail, if U.S. priorities in all of these countries are, for example, in my part of the world, it was after the war in Afghanistan started, our main priority was getting supplies down to Afghanistan, and anything that helped that along was fine. I suppose that's oversimplifying. So given that our priorities as a country here are often broader than trying to change these systems on the ground, you've mentioned a few things that are kind of huge, the billions that we took, just give it back, or the Western financial institutions. But if you were there on the ground and really wanted to help reform this deeply, deeply systemic, corrupt kleptocracies there, from your experience, where would you start? What would you do? What do you see in the countries you looked at, or where we're really making things worse? And did you see anything that's actually helping?
Let me take one or two more comments, and then I'll ask you to.
Thank you very much. Batu Kutelyan, McCain Institute. I'm from Georgia. Actually, I was part of the this boys and girls government who started these reforms in Georgia, mostly in the foreign policy and security and defense field. And I served as an ambassador here in the U.S. as well for a while. So one of the lessons that we learned doing the reforms in different fields was that the corruption was the biggest ally of our enemy, Putin and the Russian regime. And corruption was an ally not only in the Eastern European part, but everywhere where Putin can promote and could promote the erosion of the values of the system. So that was a key decision to eliminate this space. And Georgia at that time, if you can imagine, was 100% energy dependent on Russia, totally corrupted country. We had still the process of Russian military bases withdrawal going on, so security was not provided at all. I mean, then the NATO aspiration was the biggest stimulus for the society, kind of a lighthouse where we were moving, and that was the biggest driving force behind the defense and security reform in the country. So it still remains, but of course, to make this final leap ahead, of course, it should remain as a factor or the motivator to continue the reforms in the country. While in other fields, as you mentioned, the reforms are necessary, particularly where society interacts with the government, the ultimate body who exercises the power. And any sense of injustice, of course, generates a lot of backlash from the society. So that's why a lot of communication and explanation is needed besides doing the right things. So my question is more about the security element of your study you conducted. Have you considered the security environment of conducting anti-corruption reforms? And this is quite relevant to Ukraine case as well, because when the major security elements or security perception is challenged, of course it would be hard for any government, whatever reformist minded they are, to conduct the meaningful reforms. And that's what Putin understands clearly, and that he will do everything to maintain this sense of instability where the Europeans or the democratic nations would hesitate to engage. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let me take one more.
Thank you. Mine is a 50,000-foot sociological question. So,
Introduce yourself.
David Colton. When we did the mass privatization started in '89 with Václav Klaus, and I know Klaus has gone off the reservation now, but that privatization went very well in the Czech Republic. The Polish privatization went fairly well. Hungary did not go all that well, and when with the IFC at the World Bank, when we looked at Russia, we thought that we would go into Nizhny Novgorod and to Saratov because those were the two places in Russia that had some historical memory of market-based activity and quasi-European social relations. By the way, they failed too. That was with Boris Nemtsov as the governor. My point to you is that what I'm hearing today is that that sedimentary line still seems to be in place. It's called corruption now, but I put to you that in countries that did not know the Enlightenment of rationality, science, in countries that did not go through the Reformation with all the structural changes that imposed, there seems to be a fundamental tectonic resistance between wanting to be European as a lifestyle and wanting to be European at the root sociological level. And I ask, when you say, for example, that the Russian manipulation of the index, the cynicism in Moldova, when there isn't that fundamental social belief in the Enlightenment, in liberal democracy, in individualism, can anti-corruption truly succeed? Thank you.
Right, 3 very small questions.
Yeah.
Peter, would you like to go first? Take whichever piece of that you want, any of those 3 comments.
Well, the last one is such a big question. Have you considered actually thinking about it not in terms of the Enlightenment, but in terms of alcohol? Is it a wine barrier? I've heard this. Moldova has a chance. Moldova is a wine country. Ukraine has half a chance. Vodka countries, no chance.
But Poland, surely.
Poland,
Not anymore.
Poland-
Vodka drinking is falling every year, wine consumption.
And
going
also
up.
this Protestant thing, it was very interesting when I was in Russia during the Navalny campaign. I was walking around the campaigners, and I was like, oh my God, this is the Weberian ideal. They were science-educated, self-reliant small businessmen. So I think the Protestant ethic is something which is produced within systems. It's not Protestantism comes and produces people. It's just we have people and an idea of Protestantism appears, and I've seen it appear everywhere in Russia. These are state problems, not cultural problems. But that's my take on it anyway. But the other 2 questions, corruption and security. Yes, you're quite right. The great stimulus for the Georgian reforms was a security threat, which is I try to mention that, and it had been historically. It was national security, and that's what really gave it the kind of drive to sort of do these mass firings, and that's what helped people go with it, because they were like, we're not just reforming for the sake of reforming, we're reforming, or else Russia will come and eat us up.
And we'll get into NATO.
And we'll get into NATO as the lighthouse as well. So looking at Ukraine, I mean, maybe Oliver can talk more about this, it seems to me that it's an opportunity. I mean, corruption, we keep on coming back to this. This is not a moral issue. This is not even an economics issue. It's a national security issue. And once you reframe it that way, I think it becomes much more of an issue. So I don't know whether that's a chance for Poroshenko to just, sack a lot of people. I think in Ukraine, my sense is the way the Georgians started their reform with the patrol police, in Ukraine, it would seem that the army is the obvious place where to start your reforms. Can we create a reformed army? And it's a national security issue there. But Oliver can maybe tell you more about that. But there's also a trap there as well, because when you're so focused on security and you're so focused on the enemy, it sort of becomes an excuse very quickly for not doing a lot of other things. So we've kind of seen the trick used by Assad a lot. All my enemies are Al-Qaeda. I had that feeling sometimes with some of the UNM people that we can't, all our enemies are Russian agents, or all our enemies are, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes
including the ones from human rights NGOs.
Yeah, everyone is. So that there's also a danger. But I think the first stimulus, the kind of the burst that it gives, I think can be used to great effect. And the idea of what can one do, I do think this idea of the lighthouse, the framing, is so important. It's where you're going. And that's something that these societies, I mean, we talk about Poland, talk about sort of, successful reforms in Eastern Europe. We can talk about culture, but actually what we're talking about is they had a clear, place where they were going.
Yeah, it took me years to really understand this about Poland, actually, which was the importance of the EU as a goal.
Yeah, a real goal.
And it quickly became a goal that was accepted not just by the sort of ex-Solidarity people, but by ex-communists and by, a huge range of people in society. We know where we're going. We know what kind of society we want to be, and we want to be Western Europe. And that then framed the rest of the reforms. And it persuaded huge social groups who might have been doubtful about the validity of democracy, do we really need this, or who might have questioned privatization a bit more closely. But because this was all explained as we need to get to the EU, we need to join Europe again, and because it played into national sense of, national identity, and Poland's sense of being a left-out European country, it worked very well. And the question is whether the Ukrainians are able to mobilize that same kind of energy and that same kind of framing towards the same goal.
If we're talking about a country that culturally should fail, it's Serbia. And it was very clear from our conversations with our Serbian colleagues that it was working in Serbia because they had the clear goal of EU entry. It's painful. There's lots of fights, but it is actually working. The problem with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, I don't think it's cultural. It's the fact that their goal is. It's very, the lighthouse is, you can kind of hear the foghorn somewhere, but you certainly can't see it. I would, for the one-stroke solution, I would offer them very clear EU entry quite soon and prioritize that. That's the one-stroke solution, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that's likely to happen, sadly.
Well,
I think there's three excellent questions. I mean, there's probably a book in the effects of the Reformation on corruption in Eastern Europe. But in terms of what the West could do, I think something that's quite heartening. Poroshenko, the president in Ukraine, has been saying this in the last couple of days, in which he's been insisting that Parliament must pass the necessary reforms before any more money arrives from the IMF. And this is the leverage that the international institutions have at the moment. The reforms will be quite painful, but I think they are extremely necessary. It is a very difficult argument to make at the moment. And in Ukraine, some people are making the argument, well, look, while we're fighting in the East, that's the priority, that's what we need to do. However, I certainly believe it's quite clear that one of the reasons why the East is being destabilized is precisely to stop reforms. The idea that you can somehow derail the argument into one about war and not about reforms, because the more Ukraine stays corrupt, the better that is for Putin, effectively, and the more honest it is, the better that is for Europe. So what can the West do? Continue to insist that particular milestones are met before money is handed over. And this is a big problem in Parliament. I mean, it does look like there might be earlier parliamentary elections in Ukraine than we were expecting, but Parliament is one of the most rotten institutions in the entire country. I spoke to Victor Chumak, who's head of the Parliament's anti-corruption agency. He told me that he thought 10% of his fellow MPs were honest. Most anti-corruption campaigners think that's hopelessly optimistic. One of them told me it was more like 10 people. When they had to pass reform of the procurement legislation, which was an absolute, without this you will get no money from the IMF, that passed by 226 votes. One fewer vote and it wouldn't have passed. That is how corrupt Parliament is, that it was prepared to essentially abandon the future of the entire country, allow Ukraine to go bankrupt, rather than cost themselves all the money that they're making out of these procurements. I mean, I could go on. There's endless examples of this regard. So yes, continue to pressure the government on this regard, because that is the only way they can force things through Parliament. In terms of specific things that Western countries could do, obviously find, freeze and return the money that was stolen and that is in these parts of the world, and do it as quickly as possible. There are already steps being taken in Europe. Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria and UK particularly have made steps to do this, but this will be a lengthy legal process, but the sooner that can be done, the better. Far easier is to enforce our own Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts that we have in Western countries. There has been, as far as I know, and I did look quite extensively, only one Western country that has been had to pay a fine for paying bribes in Ukraine. That was a US food company. I cannot believe that there is only one company that has done this. If you ask around in any industry at all in Ukraine, you will hear names of Western companies that are notorious for paying bribes to win major procurement contracts. Since it's almost impossible to win a major procurement contract in Ukraine without having paid a bribe, all you need to do is look at the winners of procurement contracts and you can figure out who's paid the bribes. A good place to start would be in 2 enormous shale gas contracts, one of which particularly is extremely interestingly structured. These are things that prosecutors should be looking into, and the reason that this is so important is that if Western companies were forced to play by the rules, that would create a lobby within Ukraine to force other companies to play by the rules. Western companies do not want to be disadvantaged in relation to their Ukrainian and Russian competitors, and so they would begin to force the government to enforce the rules for everyone. That's something that could be done quite easily, and I mean, if anyone is in that particular world, I could give you 1 or 2 names. In terms of smaller things, but things that could have a symbolic effect slightly akin to the traffic police. The one institution in Ukraine that works is civil society. It's spectacularly, the number of activists doing extraordinary things for almost no remuneration and quite a lot of abuse is extraordinary. The assistance for civil society groups and assistance for the media is very important. By the end of the Yanukovych period, there were essentially only 3 print journalism or online journalism outlets who were doing any investigation into corruption at all. The rest had all been taken over by oligarch groups. All the TV channels have been taken over by oligarch groups. Trying to create a rival to that can tell a story without an oligarch agenda is very important. I sort of fantasize of the BBC doing a BBC Kiev like they did a BBC Persian. I think that would be a magnificent thing. Separately, another small thing that a lot of people said to me would make a big difference would be an online payment mechanism for all state payments. If you can remove the face-to-face contract in state payments, in the state payment system, you remove the opportunity to extort money. This could be done very cheaply. These things exist. It's a question of taking the Estonian one and putting it in Ukraine. It would be very easy. That would take away a lot of the possibilities for bribes. But like I say, essentially the main thing is the insistence on the big legal changes, the reforms to the prosecutor system and the other major institutions, and that, if you're not going to get money, if you don't do these things, that I think would make a big difference.
Thank you. You say a few
Yes, I would like to add a few words. Well, situation in Moldova is very much different from Ukraine and Georgia in that sense. Basically because for Moldova, that lighthouse that we call the European Union is so blurred, and the recent polls show that people are not actually supporting European integration that much anymore, because they kind of associate the European integration with the parties, with the alliance, and
the corrupt political
yeah,
alliance.
exactly. And this is why they're turning now towards the customs union, which is a Russia-led union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And Russia is showing all the benefits of this, union for Moldova, because Russia has Transnistria, where there's a great support for Russia, and also, unfortunately, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Gagauzia. Is that the correct word?
Yes.
Okay. I know how to say it in Russian. I don't know how to say it in English. Yeah, where there's a great support for Russia as well, and Russia is making a lot of concessions and sending generous aids to those regions, and Moldovan people are seeing how their European leaders are not doing anything for them, while Russia is doing so much for those, their compatriots, but they just support Russia and they can get better life. So in terms of reforms, some reforms have been implemented in the Ministry of the Internal Affairs, in the judiciary, but they look good on paper because they fulfill all the requirements that the European Union requested from Moldova. However, there is no change in practice, and I'm not sure there is a way to change it now, because Moldova is going to have parliamentary elections in November, and there is a close tie between the communists going back to power or European alliance winning again. So much will depend on how these elections will go, and I guess Russia and EU will have to take it from there.
Yeah, I wonder if in Moldova, at least the EU, but certainly the EU and the US, couldn't have used more effectively the leverage that they had in this EU negotiation process. I mean, this is one of the things we heard also in Georgia, was that The West knew that things were going badly here, for example, in terms of judicial reform. Why wasn't that used as a lever in negotiations? Why wasn't there more pressure put on the Saakashvili government to make certain kinds of changes back when the West had pressure? And I'm wondering if that wouldn't be the case in Moldova as well.
Well, I guess EU is also struggling with its own internal problems. Now there is a new bunch of commissioners are going to be appointed, and new high representatives and things like that. So while Moldova has been showing EU needs one country that can be considered a success. So Moldova can slightly be the showcase, and the situation is not that bad, it's not that drastic as in Ukraine, I guess. So that's why.
It's not a great boast.
No.
Not as Moldova, not as drastic as Ukraine.
No. A few more comments from our distinguished audience. Okay, let's see. There's one person in the way back who's got her hand up very high, so let's have her, and then we'll go back to the front row.
Whoops, is that on? Yeah, that's what you do when you're in the back, right?
Yes.
Sarah Chase from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I would just like to sort of add a dollop onto Oliver's point about security and just open the frame a little bit. So Ukraine has clearly become an international security issue, international, not just a sort of U.S. national, sparked by two anti-corruption revolutions. If you sort of look around the world, the entire Arab Spring, several of whose countries have spun off into really serious international security crises. Every country where there's an extremist insurgency is a kleptocracy, is a vertically, as you describe it, vertically integrated pyramidal kleptocracy. So I think the point is that it is, and Ukraine provides a really interesting example in the sanctions legislation here in the U.S., where for the first time explicitly corruption was an offense that could merit designating somebody under that sanctions legislation. It's like we're starting to get this, but as soon as terrorists show up, then we the decision makers, get all preoccupied by how evil terrorists are and forget that sometimes that form of extremism too is a reaction against this kind of really acute kleptocratic governance. So some of the impetus for taking some of the steps that Oliver and others are suggesting, it's about time, because this isn't sort of an unfortunate have to live with inconvenience in some of these countries. It's getting really destabilizing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Two in the front row, and then you. Sorry, making the people with microphones run back and forth. I apologize. I'll try and do it sector by sector next time. So there's one and two.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Dedisha. I am a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Energy. This question is for Peter. Given Georgia's potential for denial to entry in the European Union, would continuing to improve their current efforts or trying to change their strategy be the better choice?
All right. One more. Didn't you have your hand up? Yes. Since you're in the same section, and then we'll go back to the back.
Alex Van Oss, I teach at the Foreign Service Institute. Vodka and wine came up. I know that Georgian wine is in Russia again, and it's available here, so that's a tiny sign of hope, I suppose. My question, though, is for Mr. Bullough. These financial restrictions you mentioned, and you also mentioned where the corrupt folks keep their children. Are those the same countries that are imposing the restrictions, or these sanctions that will be imposed?
Yes. Okay. Well, why don't you take that, and then Peter take the one addressed.
Not entirely. Switzerland is, as ever, the notable exception, not being in the EU. So lots of the children like to live in Switzerland, but yes, essentially the end points are, as ever, where Vladimir Putin has a daughter in the Netherlands, Vladimir Yakunin has a son in London. I'm sure if we were to look, we'd find lots in Manhattan.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, you're referring to the sanctions being
Yes.
implemented at the moment.
Yes.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
Beginning
But-
to.
Yeah, but I mean, but
Yeah.
but the problem, by the time the money arrives in London, it's clean. The problem isn't in money laundering happening in London itself. It's happening on the way to London. Yeah.
So I had a conversation with a British friend of mine about there's an oligarch who bought an expensive property in her neighborhood, and I said, well, you know, he's said to have killed several people, and she said, yes. The trouble is that, you know, until he's been convicted of that in his country in a court, you know, we're not in a position to say you can't buy an apartment in London. So,
I mean, you know, there was a couple of years ago now, there was an official from the Russian agriculture minister whose salary was, you know, relatively generous for Russia, but still, you know, in the sort of couple of $1,000s a month kind of territory, who bought a £25 million house in West London. That was reported in the Evening Standard, and no one thought anything of it. You know, it is, you know, I think absurd that isn't somehow probed by the judicial authorities.
did you want to answer your question?
So I didn't quite understand the question. So given that Georgia, sorry, what's on? Given that Georgia isn't getting into the EU, should it change its strategy?
Right. Should that disappointment, or should they take that as a signal to continue to strengthen their current efforts,
Uh-huh.
the same approach, or try a different strategy for reform of the area?
Well, I mean, sort of one of their big priorities now is economic reforms, and partly because they sense that they're not getting into the EU, there is now a big shift. You know, especially from Ivanishvili, who's still sort of, from what I can tell, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Let's sort of buddy up with Russia. So Georgian exports are going to Russia again, and it's a, you know, I think. On the one hand, great, because aren't markets great, and money is neutral? We get very quickly into the same argument that Oliver is trying to make. But money isn't neutral, and markets aren't neutral, and we're seeing, and actually money is a security issue, and corruption is a security issue. And there's a loop there. By sort of doing the sensible thing, reopening its markets towards Russia, I mean, why wouldn't you do that? You're actually getting back into the loop of creating a security threat. I think we keep on coming back to this. We do think of money as neutral. And it's this, we have to somehow reframe the discussion about corruption and about money into security. So there's I think that's kind of the
Yeah, I think there's
danger.
there's a wider conversation about. I mean, you know, there clearly is a lot of legitimate trade with Russia.
Of course.
You know, it's absolutely, probably most of it. But there is a conversation to be had about Russian, sort of strategic Russian investment in politically connected companies, particularly in Europe. I mean, it doesn't work as well here because it's too big a country. And how those investments have until now been treated, as you say, as politically neutral. It's just money. It's coming from another, other companies with money. And at some point, there has to be a line drawn and saying, well, this investment is designed to gain the Russian state political influence in Germany or in Italy. So.
I mean, that 25 million house, do we look at it as corruption, moral, or is it actually a security risk? That's kind of the question.
Yeah, with regard to the point over there, with regard to the Arab Spring, I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, I suppose, the Arab Spring is a particularly bleak, worst-case scenario for what could happen in Ukraine if it all goes horribly wrong. Not that it's likely to turn into, I think, a military dictatorship just because the army is so astonishingly incompetent. But you know, I mean, something of that nature. Yes, I think that's an extremely good point, and something which I think more awareness.
That's what's happened in Donetsk, actually. That's sort of Girkin Assisi.
But what's very interesting, if you're talking to people in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, the complaints they have, the reason why they've risen up, if you take out the, you know, appalling abuse that Russian speakers say they've suffered, if you take that out, every other complaint is exactly the same as what people will complain about in Crimea and in Western Ukraine and in Kiev. It is, you know, corruption, abuse of power, you know, bribes. All these issues are the same issues, and you know, this is actually sort of hatred of corruption is a surprisingly uniting thing in Ukraine.
Right, a few more comments. We have probably time for a couple more rounds. We'll stop at 5:30. So, okay, one. I'll make it easier for the microphone guys. So one, and then two, and then the woman in red hair in the back. So good.
Thank you, Jeff Goldstein, Open Society Foundations. I actually wanted to follow up on that last comment. All the discussion till now has been sort of very top-down, elite-driven, but some of the people who look at Ukraine say that the thing that they see that's most different now compared to 2004 is that 2004 was, again, an elite-led change, whereas now it's more bottom-up. Fighting corruption also has a bottom-up cultural aspect to it. Do you think events on the Maidan give a greater chance now that there's a constituency that's going to hold the politicians and the elites feet to the fire on these issues?
So I think that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah. To back in that direction.
There is another lady who might
Yeah.
be behind the pillar.
There are two ladies
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Let's do the two ladies. One there and one there. So, and then
Thanks. My name's Tanya. I am a student at the University of Maryland. I'm also Ukrainian. So, Oliver, thank you so much for your comments about the media and civil society as the kind of two driving forces for anything anti-corruption that's happening in Ukraine. And I just want to add to that and say that as much as kind of slowly after the protests and like during the conflict, Ukrainian media has been trying to get back to being more independent, and civil society has obviously been kind of on the rise. There is still quite a lot of Russian influence in both of those sectors, and the people who are looking to Russia are seeing that both of those areas in Russia are actually getting progressively worse. I mean, the media is becoming less and less independent, and civil society, there's quite a lot of investigations also going on, but also quite a lot of court cases and court proceedings and house arrests and things like that. So I think that it's for the people who are still very much attentive to Russia, among which are a lot of Ukrainian politicians, especially sort of the part of parliament which you described as the people who, kind of just want to drag things back as much as possible. They're looking to Russia, and I think for a lot of them it's like, well, if Russians can get away with it, that maybe there's hope for us and we can also get away with it. So I think Russian influence there shouldn't be discounted, and any international efforts at kind of helping Ukrainian media and Ukrainian civil society should also kind of be looking towards Russia and trying to see, well, is there any way that there's any chance to shift what's happening in Russia, which I think the international community has kind of given up on a little bit due to just kind of there just not being a lot of progress there.
sorry, not woman and right there.
Thank you. I am Anne Applebaum from Georgia. Currently, I am fellow at National Endowment for Democracy. When we talk about corruption in Georgia, I always say like this, that we should differentiate petty corruption and high-level elite corruption. Because on the one hand, previous government of the Georgia was really very successful to eliminate petty corruption. And although as a human rights defender, I have a lot of reasons to be very angry on the previous government, I really give credit to them for this. But on the other hand, they were also very successful to create a huge system of elite corruption, and all ties of businesses with the government and paying money to the government and financing pre-election campaigns of the government, and also there were several businesses which were favored by the previous government, and they were winning all bids and all procurements by the government. So, and there are a lot of examples of this. So it is really very interesting example how the government can be on the one hand very successful to eliminate petty corruption, and on the other hand to create really strong high-level corruption. So I'm interested during your study if you came across to these examples and what would be your comment on this. Thank you.
Okay, I think those were, well, there was one more. Let's do one more right here.
Hi, my name is Vlad Spun. I'm with the Moldova Foundation. I'm a Moldovan myself, so I will address Moldova, but in context of today's discussion. I think the focus on corruption as an impediment for these countries to move towards European integration was very good tackled, but the reaction from the auditorium is that there is more than corruption. And I would say that there are two anchors that prevent these three countries from being through European democracy. So one is the national anchor, which is corruption you tackled, and mentality that somebody else mentioned. And second is geopolitical anchor that was put on these countries by Russia. And these three, this big external anchor has several small anchors. One is the Russian-controlled territories, which is true for Georgia, it's true for Ukraine now, and true for Moldova. There is economic anchors, Russian market or gas prices and so forth, and mass media. Mass media that especially I know in Moldova and Ukraine is similar, it's very much controlled by Russia in terms of reaching out to audience. So we need to look at the corruption in context, what is happening on the ground. And I hope the Institute of Modern Russia next research will focus on external anchors because they know the best from Moscow how these anchors are implemented in these three countries. Thank you.
Right, so final thoughts.
Yes.
What answer to some of those or anything else that you feel moved by? Oliver.
With regard to the point about the difference between the Orange Revolution and this one, yes, the fact this was bottom-up is absolutely key, and that is having a big effect on the way corruption is being dealt with. There are a number of sort of spontaneous civil society groups that have been created themselves in order to fight very hard, to lobby very hard for anti-corruption legislation, who are coming up with some really original ideas, and the reanimation initiative is one particularly that's worth keeping an eye on. With regard to the Russian influence on the Ukrainian media, that is clearly true with regard to the sort of state size, but I just to give the other side of that, just to add to that point, on an individual level, I think it's worth acknowledging the role that Russian individuals have had in actually developing and opening up the Ukrainian media. The most famous chat show host in Ukraine, Talat Shuster, is a Russian. He was previously on NTV before he was sort of squeezed out for being a bit freely spoken. Vladimir Fedorin, who's a Russian journalist who previously edited Ukrainian Forbes before it was taken over by an oligarch and changed, and he was the main investigative editor into corruption in Ukraine. So yes, on a state level, the Russian influence has been harmful. I think on an individual level, actually, Russian journalists have been extremely helpful in helping their Ukrainian colleagues who, after all, have a much smaller market to serve, in helping them really develop their techniques.
Right. Peter, final thoughts?
I'll try to. Firstly, the Georgian thing about elite corruption. Yes, I agree. I think the things to talk about in the paper is what we do now. Clearly, there was that kind of elite corruption, and that was deeply connected to the courts, because the courts were the mechanism through which that elite corruption could kind of be practiced. The question is, what do we do now? Do you go back and do massive lustration? Do you open up all those deals? The court cases aren't being touched because there's a real fear that it'll just open up this Pandora's box. How do you start doing restitution? So it really is, I think, Georgia, is fascinating. Like, how do you now undo this bizarre web of elite corruption and injustice? And there's a real paralysis in society. There's a lot of anger. Why isn't this being fixed? But if you start to fix it, things could just spiral out of control. So I'm just going to leave it hanging there. We explore that in the paper. And both Jeffrey Robertson, who's was our lawyer in the team, and Jovan Ratkovic, who looked at the Serbian experience of that process. It's a real problem. What do you do afterwards? So have a look at the reports. We don't come up with a definitive answer, but that's how do you move forward. But the bottom-up thing and the Russian anchorage thing, they're all kind of weirdly connected, it seems to me. Apart from the bottom-up parts in Ukraine, the only way that we're going to fix the corruption in the West, which perpetrates the system in Russia and Ukraine, is by doing bottom-up campaigns against corruption. I mean, the problem is, you mentioned sort of sanctions coming in from Britain and America against some Russian officials. It's going to be tiny. They're going to do the minimum. They're not going to touch the tax havens more than they can they're going to touch them as less as they can, simply because there's such a huge revenue, especially for Britain. And there was a very funny case recently at an embassy, a British embassy somewhere in the world, where they had to do, the embassy had to do deals with local businessmen. And the ambassador got two messages. He got one from the Secret Service to say, don't touch these guys. He got one from the trade, DTI, the trade kind of body, saying, these guys are great. And he didn't know who to listen to. And so that tension will continue. Don't expect governments to do too much to clamp down on corruption. It's too lucrative. The only way to do it is really a moment as big as sort of the human rights movement in the 60s and 70s, where bottom-up organizations start to put pressure on our own governments to clamp down on corruption. And actually, those laws exist. We do have all these legal mechanisms out there. So it's very funny, in the 1970s, Russian dissidents would try to get their own powers to obey their own laws. That was like their great call, obey your own human rights laws. It's actually now got to the point where we sort of need a very big bottom-up movement in the West to get governments here to obey our own money laundering laws. And that will in turn put pressure on the Russian system, which would maybe help start to loose some of those anchors. So the geopolitical problem can actually be, in a small but I think very significant way, countered by bottom-up anti-corruption initiatives here. See what I mean? Yes.
Olga, last word.
Yes, I wanted to make a few comments on the Russia influence thing, because I think Moldova is the only of the three countries that hasn't actually defined itself as a country that opposes integration towards Russia, because Georgia had the war in 2008. Ukraine has defined its way now, and Moldova has been, I mean, it's 100% dependent on Russian gas. It exports a lot of its fruit to Russia, and Russia has already been playing this card, banning, restricting these imports. But Moldovan civil society, from the research that we've been doing on this paper, is not that strong, and people are a little bit scared of the Ukrainian scenario, and they're scared that Russia might try to, invade Moldova and try to take away Transnistria. So people don't really know what to do, where to look. So I'm not sure this is the right moment for Moldova to fight corruption. They still have to define their way first, like where they want to go, and then
Right. Thank you. Thank you all very much. These are the three papers: Revolutionary Tactics on Georgia, Moldova, the Failing Champion of European Integration, and Looting Ukraine, How East and West Teamed Up to Steal a Country. And they're all available outside and online. Thank you very much. Thank you.